A cop pulls a gun on a black woman already injured in a crash. 12 minutes later, he's the one behind bars. But what led to this shocking turn of events? This story begins like too many others, an officer abusing his authority, targeting someone who needed his help. But what makes this different is how quickly things unraveled. A black woman, bruised and hurt from a car crash, is about to face a terrifying nightmare at the hands of someone sworn to protect her. What she didn't know was that the wheels of justice were already turning behind the scenes. And before the clock struck 12 minutes, the tables were turned. Before we dive deep into story, quickly comment where in the world you are watching from. The story begins with Lisa Williams, an ordinary woman on what should have been an ordinary day, until the moment she found herself in an extraordinary and terrifying situation. She was on her way to meet her sister, casually humming along to the radio when, out of nowhere, a car came barreling into her lane, side-swiping her vehicle and sending it careening toward the guardrail. Metal screeched against metal as her car collided with the barrier. Her heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline surging through her veins as she struggled to regain control. When the car finally stopped, Lisa was left bruised, shaken, and disoriented. The world around her felt like it was spinning. Smoke curled up from the crumpled hood of her car, the acrid scent of burning rubber filling the air. She winced in pain as she clutched her injured leg. Her knee was throbbing, sharp pain radiating up her thigh with each movement. But she was alive. That was all she could focus on. She'd survived. The worst was over, or so she thought. Still dazed, Lisa fumbled for her phone, thinking she should call for help. But before she could dial, the flashing lights of a police cruiser appeared in her rearview mirror. Relief washed over her for a split second, until she saw the officer who stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as though it hadn't smiled in years. This was Officer Derek Hansen, a man notorious around town for his short temper and aggressive demeanor. His reputation preceded him, and as soon as Lisa saw his eyes narrow in her direction, that relief she felt was swiftly replaced with unease. Instead of rushing over to check if she was hurt, instead of offering assistance like any decent officer might, Hansen approached with a look of pure disdain. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he was taking his time, relishing whatever was about to unfold. Lisa braced herself. "Are you out of your mind? What the hell were you thinking, driving like that?" he barked, not even glancing at the crumpled side of her car or the fact that she was visibly hurt. Lisa blinked in confusion. I wasn't," she stammered, her voice shaky from the shock. "I was hit. Another car. It came out of nowhere." But Officer Hansen didn't seem interested in hearing her explanation. His eyes, cold and unfeeling, flicked from her face to her leg for a moment, but he showed no sign of concern. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence looming over her. Without warning, he grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. "Get out of the car," he ordered, yanking her hard enough that she let out a cry of pain. Her injured knee buckled beneath her as she was forced out of the seat, her body collapsing awkwardly against the door. "Wait, please. My leg. It hurts," Lisa pleaded, trying to steady herself. "Stop resisting," Hansen snapped, his voice cold and harsh. He shoved her roughly against the side of her car, pinning her there as though she were some kind of threat. The force of the impact made her cry out again, but it didn't seem to faze him. "I'm not resisting," she gasped, her voice trembling as tears filled her eyes. But it didn't matter to him. Hansen had already decided how this was going to play out. To him, she wasn't a victim in need of help. She was an inconvenience, someone to be dealt with as quickly and harshly as possible. The situation spiraled rapidly. Every word Lisa tried to say was met with more aggression. Hansen twisted her arms behind her back, locking her wrists into handcuffs with a force that sent searing pain through her already injured body. She was crying now, the fear, pain, and shock of the accident all blending into one overwhelming wave of helplessness. People passing by in their cars slowed to watch, but no one stopped. No one intervened. To them, it was just another roadside incident, another unfortunate driver in trouble with the law. They couldn't see the terror in Lisa's eyes or the bruises forming on her wrists where the cuffs dug in. And just when Lisa thought it couldn't get any worse, Officer Hansen leaned in close, his voice dripping with malice. "You people, always making excuses, always the victim." Lisa's heart sank. There it was, the real reason for his hostility. It wasn't just an accident to him. It was something much uglier, much more deep-seated. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but her voice caught in her throat. There was no one to hear her anyway. In that moment, Lisa realized she was completely at his mercy, if he had any. And from the look in his eyes, it was clear he didn't. Lisa's mind raced, heart pounding in her chest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. How could the man who was supposed to protect and serve treat her like this? The pain from her injured leg was unbearable, sending sharp jolts through her body every time she shifted. She was barely able to stand, her knee threatening to give out beneath her. But she knew if she collapsed, things might only get worse. "Please, I'm hurt," she begged, her voice cracking with desperation. "My leg. I can't stand." But every word she spoke seemed to fall on deaf ears. Or worse, it only fueled the fire inside him. Officer Hansen's face twisted in anger, his nostrils flaring as he leaned in closer. There was no compassion in his eyes, only cold, unrelenting rage. And for what? What had she done besides survive an accident? More people had gathered by now, forming a small crowd on the other side of the street. The flashing lights of the police car and the loud shouting had drawn attention. Some onlookers stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Others began pulling out their phones, recording the escalating confrontation. They might not have known Lisa's full story, but anyone watching could tell something wasn't right. Then it happened. Officer Hansen shoved her to the ground. Hard. The pavement met her body with a sickening thud, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Her head hit the asphalt, and for a moment, everything went blurry. She could hear the gasps from the crowd, but no one stepped forward to help. It was as if the bystanders were paralyzed, trapped behind the lens of their smartphones, recording but doing nothing to stop it. Lisa was now lying face down on the street, her body bruised, her spirit breaking. She was injured, vulnerable, and now completely helpless. Fear gripped her, stronger than ever before. The thought flashed through her mind. Asterisk, am I going to die here? Asterisk, would she become another name? Another face in the headlines, brutalized and left to bleed out in the street while people just stood by and watched? She had heard the stories before. She'd seen the viral videos. Countless black men and women beaten or worse by those in uniform. Stories where justice seemed like a distant dream. But she never thought it would happen to her. Not like this. Not on a day that had started out so normal. As Lisa lay there, her cheek pressed against the cold pavement, she felt her panic rising. Her breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps, her chest heaving. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that sent a new wave of terror through her. Officer Hansen had reached for his baton. The metal rod glinted in the sunlight as he raised it high above his head. His face contorted in fury. He was about to strike her again. And this time, Lisa wasn't sure she'd survive it. Her mind screamed for help. The crowd was still there, recording, murmuring, but no one moved to intervene. For a fleeting second, Lisa thought this was it, her last moment. The world felt like it had slowed down, everything moving in agonizing slow motion as she braced herself for the blow. But then, something shifted. Just as Officer Hansen prepared to bring the baton down, something, or rather someone, stopped him. In the chaos of the moment, Lisa didn't realize it, but one witness in the crowd had done more than just film. They had made a decision that would change everything. Unbeknownst to anyone on the scene, this person had captured the entire violent assault on camera and, in a moment of bravery, had sent the footage directly to the police department's Internal Affairs Division. Not to the local officers, not to anyone on the scene. Straight to Internal Affairs, bypassing any chance of a cover-up. What happened next was a blur of shouting, lights, and sirens. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. As Lisa lay on the cold ground, her body trembling with fear and pain, She could barely breathe. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, her entire body locked in survival mode. But something else was happening, something she couldn't see. Unbeknownst to her, wheels were already in motion. The video evidence was spreading quickly, and it had landed in the hands of the right people. Internal affairs moved fast, faster than Hansen or anyone else could anticipate. As Lisa lay there, barely clinging to consciousness, the sound of new sirens filled the air. Reinforcements were arriving, but not the kind Officer Hansen had hoped for. Instead of backing him up, they were here to stop him. Just 12 minutes after the attack began, the tension that had been simmering in the air suddenly broke with a sharp, crackling noise from Officer Hansen's radio. He was still standing over Lisa, baton poised to strike, when the unexpected sound jolted him out of his aggression. His hand froze mid-swing as the voice crackled over the airwaves, its tone calm but authoritative. "Officer, stop immediately," the voice commanded. Hansen's brow furrowed in confusion. He glanced around, almost as if he thought someone was playing a cruel joke. But the voice continued, this time more stern. "This is a direct order from Internal Affairs. Cease all action and wait for backup." The weight of the words hit him, and for the first time that day, Officer Hansen hesitated. His eyes darted from Lisa, still crumpled on the ground, to the crowd of onlookers with their phones raised. Reality seemed to catch up to him all at once. The baton still hovered in the air, his knuckles white around its handle, but the power he had felt moments ago was slipping through his fingers. He lowered his arm, confusion etched across his face. What had just happened? Internal Affairs? How? Before he could make sense of it, another squad car screeched to a stop a few yards away. But this time, it wasn't the usual officers coming to back him up. These weren't his colleagues. These were the very people he feared most. Internal Affairs. The doors of the car swung open, and two stern-looking officers in plain clothes stepped out, their eyes locked on Hansen with a cold intensity. The crowd, which had been murmuring nervously, fell silent. The atmosphere shifted, the once cocky Officer Hansen now the subject of the crowd's gaze. No longer the aggressor, he was now the one facing justice. As the Internal Affairs officers approached, Hansen finally dropped his baton, his face pale. His hands twitched at his sides as though he was still debating whether to resist or comply. But there was no choice left. He knew it, and so did everyone watching. Officer Derek Hansen, one of the Internal Affairs agents, said as they moved in, "You're under arrest for excessive use of force and assault." The moment was surreal. Just minutes ago, Hansen had been the one in control, poised to deal another brutal blow. But now the tables had turned. He stood there frozen, his face drained of color, as the IA officers reached for his wrists. The clink of handcuffs being fastened around his wrists echoed in the hushed crowd. The man who had terrorized Lisa was now the one being restrained. The onlookers watched in stunned silence as Hansen, the once fearsome officer, was led away like a common criminal. His gun and badge were unceremoniously stripped from him, the very symbols of his authority now gone. The crowd parted as the Internal Affairs officers marched Hansen to the back of their squad car, the same one meant for criminals. He didn't struggle, didn't speak. He simply stared ahead, dazed, as if he was still trying to process how everything had unraveled so quickly. For Lisa, the sight was almost too much to comprehend. She lay on the pavement, her body trembling from pain and shock, her mind still trying to catch up with everything that had happened. The officer who had brutalized her, who had shoved her to the ground and nearly beaten her senseless, was now in handcuffs. It was hard to believe. As Hansen was placed into the back of the car, one of the Internal Affairs officers turned his attention to Lisa. He knelt down beside her, his voice gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she had just endured. "Ma'am," he said softly, "we're going to take care of you." The words were simple, but they were the first kindness Lisa had heard since the nightmare began. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from the pain in her leg or the bruises on her body, but from the overwhelming relief that maybe, just maybe, this ordeal was finally over. But even as she lay there, surrounded by flashing lights and murmuring voices, Lisa realized that the nightmare wasn't truly over. Not yet. Yes, Officer Hansen was in custody, but the trauma of what had happened would stay with her. The memory of being brutalized, of feeling utterly powerless, wouldn't simply disappear because justice had finally intervened. The officers lifted her gently onto a stretcher, paramedics checking her vitals as the crowd began to disperse. Lisa's body ached with every movement, but there was a flicker of hope amid the pain. She had survived, and the man who had tried to destroy her life was finally being held accountable. As she was loaded into the ambulance, Lisa caught one final glimpse of Hansen through the rearview mirror. His face was blank, as though he still couldn't believe what had happened. The crowd's cameras may have caught the violence, but now they had captured something even more important: accountability. The wheels of justice had turned in her favor, and though the road ahead would be long, Lisa knew she wasn't alone anymore. For the first time since the accident, she felt like she could breathe again. In the days that followed, the video of the assault spread like wildfire across social media. What had started as a few shaky phone recordings in the hands of bystanders quickly became a national story. News outlets picked up the footage, replaying the brutal assault again and again, each showing the moment Lisa was thrown to the ground, her vulnerability on full display. The public outrage was swift and fierce. Protests erupted across the city, with activists and community members calling for justice, not just for Lisa, but for all the victims of unchecked police violence. Signs reading "No More Brutality" and "Justice for Lisa" dotted the streets, and the hashtag Justice for Lisa trended for days. This wasn't just about one officer's actions anymore. It had become a flashpoint for a broader conversation about policing, power, and systemic injustice. Officer Hansen, the man who had once felt untouchable in his authority, was swiftly suspended and soon faced charges of assault and abuse of power. His arrest had already sent shockwaves through the police department, but the speed of the legal response was almost unprecedented. There were no delays, no attempts to sweep it under the rug. The pressure from the public and the undeniable evidence on video had forced the system to act, and for once it had acted quickly. For Lisa, however, the whirlwind of events brought conflicting emotions. On one hand, there was a sense of relief. She didn't have to fight for years to be heard, to be believed. Her story hadn't been buried, and the officer who had brutalized her was now facing justice. But on the other hand, there was anger, deep simmering anger. This wasn't just about Hansen's individual cruelty. This was about a system that had allowed someone like him to operate unchecked for so long. How many other people had he hurt? How many more officers like him were still out there, hiding behind their badges, feeling invincible? The anger gnawed at Lisa, even as she slowly recovered from her physical injuries. Her leg was healing, but the emotional scars ran deeper. She replayed the events in her mind over and over. The helplessness she felt, the cold pavement beneath her, the crowd watching but unable to help. It wasn't just the brutality that haunted her. It was the knowledge that if it hadn't been for that one person who sent the video to Internal Affairs, she might have been just another statistic, another story buried in the news cycle. Despite everything, there was a glimmer of hope. Justice had moved quickly this time. Hansen's trial, though brief, was a powerful moment. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The video footage, witness testimonies, and even his fellow officers distancing themselves from him all painted a damning picture. The jury didn't take long to reach a verdict. Guilty on all charges. Hansen, once a symbol of unchecked authority, now stood in a courtroom, sentenced to time behind bars. His badge, which had once shielded him from consequences, was now just a distant memory. For Lisa, the conviction brought some closure, but it didn't erase the trauma. The road to healing was long, both physically and emotionally. There were nights where she woke up in a cold sweat, reliving the moment Hansen raised his baton, certain she wouldn't survive. But in those darkest moments, she reminded herself of the outcome. She had survived. And more than that, she had sparked a conversation about police accountability that could no longer be ignored. In the aftermath of the trial, calls for reform echoed louder than ever before. City officials announced plans to reevaluate police practices, and the community rallied around the need for greater oversight and transparency. The video of Lisa's assault had become more than just a piece of evidence. It was a catalyst for change. And through it all, Lisa remained a quiet but powerful symbol of resilience. She didn't seek the spotlight, didn't want to be defined by what had happened to her. But she knew that her story had struck a chord. The city, and maybe even the country, had finally woken up to the reality that justice couldn't wait, that accountability had to come faster. Sometimes justice is agonizingly slow. Too many families had waited years, if they ever saw justice at all. But in Lisa's case, it only took 12 minutes for the scales to tip in her favor. 12 minutes for a witness to send that crucial video. 12 minutes for internal affairs to intervene. 12 minutes for the tide to turn. And though Lisa would carry the weight of that day for the rest of her life, she also carried something else. The knowledge that change, real change, was possible. Sometimes it took 12 minutes. Sometimes it took much longer. But justice had arrived, and for once, it didn't miss its mark. If you found this story as compelling as we did, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts below. Let's continue to challenge injustice together.